And I was born in 1954, and the war was still, you know, a major preoccupation in our house, and the question of what had happened to the Germans in World War II and how a race of people that was the most educated, civilized, and humane race had descended into that kind of barbarism. And there was, you know, it was a subject of constant debate and attention in our home, and it was the Holocaust was, you know, was regarded as the nadir of modern human existence. And so I grew up with those assumptions and grew up believing that the state of Israel was this extraordinary, you know, blossom in the desert. It was an oasis of democracy, of values, of human rights in a midst of sea of totalitarianism. And I made that assumption. I mean, I assumed that my children would feel the same way. I was shocked in recent years that my kids coming home from college had a very different narrative about Israel that they had picked up from their, you know, from the Gestalt, from the milieu. And that narrative is the narrative that has been adopted in recent years by the Democratic Party, which sees Israel as an occupying nation, an imperium, oppressing indigenous Palestinians, and as you know, as a racist state and an apartheid state. And you know, part of my campaign is going to be a major piece of it is going to be explaining to American citizens why that view is wrong, and making the moral case for Israel. Israel, as you know, is the only place in the Mideast where there's freedom of expression for all citizens. 1.9 million Palestinians in Israel, and they vote. Palestinians serve in the legislature. They serve in the courts. They serve, I believe there's 3 Palestinians on the 12-person Supreme Court. There's no place in the Mideast where there is a Jew on any court or any legislature. Maybe in Morocco, there may be some public officials who are Jewish, but nowhere in the Mideast. It's the only place where women have rights. As you know, this week, people in Iran are being jailed. Women are being jailed for wearing habibs or not wearing habibs. It's the only place where gays have rights. There was 2 weeks ago a gay pride parade in Israel with 150,000 people in both Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. At the same time, the government of Iran is hanging gays from cherry pickers and castrating them. And that is true throughout the Mideast. It's the only place where there's freedom of religion, where you are free to practice any religion that you want in Israel. It's the only place where you can have freedom of expression. A Palestinian who wants to criticize his government had better do it in Israel. It's the only place where he can do it. If he does that in the West Bank, he will be tortured and killed and arrested. Or in Gaza. And the Israeli Supreme Court, and I've been a critic of the current reforms or the modifications of the Supreme Court in Israel. I can criticize Israel without being an anti-Semite. I want to talk about that in a minute. But Israel's Supreme Court judiciary is the most humane judiciary in the world. As somebody who's a litigator and a constitutional scholar, who taught law for 35 years, there is no country in the world with a court like a judiciary like Israel. This is the only country that have actually dealt with the ticking time bomb issue. So the ticking time bomb issue scenario is if there's a terrorist who knows the location of a bomb that is about to kill civilians in huge numbers, can you torture that person to find out where the bomb is located? In Israel, the law is clear. You cannot. You cannot. And that is evidence of the humanity that you see in all of Israel's policies, military policies, the hold that the court has over Israel. I'm very proud of the Israeli Supreme Court. I don't want to see it dismantled. I think it is a source of pride to the world about what an independent judiciary can do. They won't allow people to, it won't allow the military to capture people's relatives in order to pressure somebody to talk. The conduct of the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, when they go into Palestinian territories is beyond anything in the world. Colonel Camp, one of the leading military historians and tacticians around the world, said, last week, 2 weeks ago, when Israel went to Jenin, Jenin is a bomb factory. Most nations, Russia, when it was dealing with issues like Jenin and Chechnya, simply bombed the neighborhood, because you have a neighborhood where virtually 100% of the people who live there are supporting terrorism, where the terrorists are hiding behind civilians, and where everybody is involved in bomb making. And those bombs are destined to kill civilians, to be strapped on men, women, and children, and kill civilians in Israel. Most nations, and we've done this ourselves, and clearly Russia was doing it in Chechnya. Chechnya would go in there and bomb that neighborhood. What the Israeli IDF does is they send people to do retail combat, door to door, putting IDF soldiers at risk in order to avoid civilian casualties, collateral casualties. In the recent Jenin attack, there was 12 terrorists who were killed, all of them involved in bomb making, all of them involved in planning attacks on Jewish civilians, and not a single innocent person, child or civilian. Israel is unique in the Mideast for saying we're only going to attack military targets, and they're very, very disciplined about doing so. Palestine, the Palestinian Authority, in contrast, follows a long tradition of deliberately targeting civilians. So anybody, and not only that, but they have a pay-to-slay policy. That is the official policy of the Palestinian Authority. If you kill a Jew, not a member of the IDF, if you kill any Jew, you are going to get awarded with pay for life. And if you go to jail or you're killed, your family will get payments for life. And the official policy of Hamas is the genocide of all the Jews. So they consider, and this, by the way, in 1948, when Israel was attacked at its birth, the plans were captured of Syria and Egypt and the other nations, and their plan was complete extermination of the Jews. They took the side of Hitler during World War II. They lost the war, and the practice and the policy of all those nations is to kill individual civilians, whereas Israel does the opposite. It only attacks military targets. Now, in any attack, civilians do die, and that's always a tragedy and always an atrocity, but it's not deliberate. And they're unique in that sense, and I just want to go through a little bit of the history of Israel, because Israel, for many of you who don't know the history, first of all, the Jews have been there for 3,700 years. The term Palestine was actually invented by the Romans when they were trying to exterminate the Jews and move them out. They named Judea after the Jews' enemies, the Philistines. But it was part of the Ottoman Empire. Palestine was part of the Ottoman Empire, and the Palestinians during World War I fought against the Allied forces, so they were on the losing side. And at the end of the war, the Ottoman Empire was dismantled, And the League of Nations, Woodrow Wilson said, here's what we're going to do. We're going to take apart the Ottoman Empire and we're going to give the ownership of those countries to the indigenous people who lived in the country. Well, Palestine was a large area, what's called the British Mandate, and more than half the people who lived there were Jews. I think it was about 600,000. I think there were about 500,000 Palestinians. I could be wrong about those numbers, and they're probably disputed. Despite that fact, so there were two groups that were due to get land. And 4/5 of the land, because of bigotry against the Jews, 4/5 of that land was given to the Palestinians. It's now called Jordan. And 1/5, a tiny little sliver of traditional land, was given to the Jews. And then it was a series of wars. In 48, Israel became a state. All the nations around it attacked it, and some of them took chunks away. The Gaza Strip was taken. The Judea and Samaria, the West Banks, were taken by Jordan, and the Temple Mount was also taken by Jordan. And Israel lived without those for many years, and then those countries all attacked Israel again with an unprovoked attack in 1967. I remember sitting with my father on the patio beside our swimming pool when he got a call from the White House, and somebody on that phone told him that Syria and Egypt had just attacked Israel, and Jordan would soon join it. Israel said to Jordan, please don't attack us, and we won't touch your land, we won't attack you. Jordan attacked anyway. And as a result of that, I remember I said to my father, how can Israel survive? Because the land owned by the Arabs is 600 times the land owned by Israel. It's a tiny, tiny little sliver, 20 miles across. I said, how can they survive with all these giant nations attacking them? And he said to me, the Israelis are tough, which was the highest accolade that he could give anybody. So I knew, I understood his admiration for them. The Israelis won that war by a miracle, and they took back the Temple Mount, which was theirs. It was their part of the mandate. They took the West Bank, and they took the Gaza Strip, and they gave the Golan Heights. And then the UN resolution and the Israel government said, we will give those lands all back to the countries from which they took, even though we won them fairly in a war, even though they are part of our historical lands, we will trade land for peace. If you promise that you won't attack us anymore, we will give you back that land. And again, the Israelis have negotiated with the Palestinians at Camp David, and again and again, the Israelis have offered to make giant concessions and give back all the land if there would be peace. And every time the Palestinians refused, Prince Bandar, who was at Camp David and who was from Saudi Arabia, the Prince of Saudi Arabia, who was the referee at Camp David, that it was 100% the fault of Yasser Arafat. They would not take the most generous concessions. And that brings us to where we are today, which is that young Palestinians are being taught to murder Jews in the schools. And some 80% of the Palestinian people, when they're polled in poll after poll, says that it is okay to murder Jews, individual Jews, and Israel has no right to exist, and that ultimately it must be destroyed. Oh, Israel, listen, when our country was during World War II, we have a big country. It's very, very hard to invade us. And during World War II, every country, when it's under national security threat, it imposes restrictions on citizens. You become something of a national security state. We put Japanese in concentration camps who did nothing in World War II. Israel has not done that. Israel takes precautions. But every Palestinian, 1.9 Palestinians, million Palestinians who live in Israel vote and they participate. They're not called to the army. They're not required to serve like other people are. I'll say one other thing. During the Oslo Accords, one of the agreements during the Oslo Accords was that Palestinians had a right to return, who lived in Israel, had a right to return to Palestine. And they assumed that hundreds of thousands of them would do so, and they would be given land in Palestine. And they would live under the Palestinian Authority. There's a lot of empty land in Palestine, and they were given the right to go there. It was assumed hundreds of thousands of them would take advantage of that offer, but only 4,000 went. And why is that? Why do they prefer to live in Israel? Because of the freedom in Israel. So, and these are issues that you may dispute with me, but you need to think about them. And these are the issues that I talk to my kids about and that I want to talk to the Democratic Party about. Because the current narrative about Israel is not an accurate narrative. It's a narrative that is at ultimate, and listen, if you want it, everybody can criticize Israel. That's not anti-Semitic, but if you criticize Israel and you are applying a different standard to Israel than to the countries around it, if you take the United Nations, passed last year something like, 50 or 60 resolutions against Israel, more than all of the other countries in the world combined. And yet, there are many, many countries that have really reprehensible human rights records, and they never get reprimanded by the UN. Oh, if you're holding Israel alone to this standard, and you don't hold nations to that standard that are much, much worse than Israel, and you have to wonder whether that is not anti-Semitism.